What's up, guys? Welcome back to Roensch Capital Charts. Today we're taking a look at Nvidia stock, ticker symbol NVDA, on a variety of time frames in anticipation of the next trading day, Wednesday, February 28th. Nvidia stock here today down $3.91 a share, minus 0.49%. Let's take a look here, pull out as much bias as we can out of today's session, and look at levels that I'm paying attention to heading into tomorrow. First of all, after hours here, the stock is down about $1.75, about $1.80, whatever. Listen, as always, in after hours, take the movement with a grain of salt. I mean, look at, like, you guys, I always say this, look at this. The volume is ridiculous, and you want to see something even crazier? Notice how, like, thick and full and dense the candles are on Nvidia all day long, right? Because the volume is high. But you start getting into after hours, and you get just these garbage little neutral candle, untradable. One order, right, with enough size will just push it around. So listen, as always, I mean, it's not uncommon to see stocks fade in after hours, but the real test is always going to be the market open on the following day. Let's move on now to the 5-minute. We got this big, ugly dump off right off the open, about 5-10 minutes in. And let's pull out some context out of the volume profile. The 5-minute, I think, is the best time frame to do this on. Now, because you're able to get, the reason I say that is because you're able to get really specific on time of day, but you still have enough bulk of volume because it's the 5-minute, rather than using the 1 minute. So look here, we expect big volume off the open. Look at this big red candle. This part of each video, this part of our daily ritual here is, I think, the most contextual in a lot of ways, because look at this. You see this bottoming candle with the big bottoming wick. And a lot of traders would look at that and say, oof, the bears won that candle. Is that true? There was nearly 2 million, 1.9 million shares of volume traded in 5 minutes. And the massive bottoming wick, you know what that tells me? That tells me that this battle, or this candle wick, or this candle in general more so, was a major battle between bulls and bears, and the bears just happened to win. It's a red candle, right? But the bulls, they held their own. I mean, we wicked down to 771.62 and the candle closed at 778, right? I mean, quite the battle within that 5 minutes. And that happened to be the bottoming reversal candle. So the fact that there's that much volume on there, I mean, listen, if I'm a bear, even I'm just trying to cherry pick things that fit my bias. If I'm bearish on Nvidia, I can't look at that and say with any definitive, that's not a definitive candle to me. Not at all. So my number one tip, I suppose, when you're looking at volume profiles on any time frame, but I suppose in particular on the 5-minute here, since that's what we're looking at, make sure you're contextual with how the volume comes in. Make sure you're looking at the candle. For example, if this big ugly red candle had twice the volume of the opening candle, then I'd be lying to you if I said the bears didn't win that. Of course, that's not what happened. We got on the third candle massive volume and a huge bottoming wick. Changes the story completely. Now, let's move on here to the 30-minute chart and start looking at levels that I'm going to be watching incredibly closely as we move in to tomorrow. Here on the 30-minute, yesterday when we covered Nvidia, you guys remember I was talking about how ideally I would have loved to see a reclaim of that 50 period. That thing, we rode that 50 period as a resistance all day long. So now even more so tomorrow. All right, pressure's on. Not really, but pressure's on day to day. I want to see a reclaim of the 50 period. I mean, right? Because that opens up a move. We can't move to 800 without reclaiming the 50 period. And 800, you're going to see here in a second, 800 becomes a much, much bigger goal. But it all starts here because, we respected that level far too well today from a bullish perspective on the 30-minute chart here. Right? And for those of you who are like, what's that line? It's the 50 period simple moving average here on the 30-minute chart. Now, bears, you see how this is starting to curl downside just a little bit here in after hours. Ideally for you guys, you would love to see that curl continue. The stock flat, stock down, whatever. As long as here on the 30-minute in particular, that curl continues downside and adds a descending psychological barrier, I think you guys would be happy. Any upside test as a bear, obviously you'd like to see a repeat of what occurred today right in that region. Okay, now let's move on here to the 4-hour chart. Listen, hey, while I'm talking here, while you're listening, head down to the comment section. Let me know what your position is, and I'm curious what your time frame is. Do you own calls, puts, long shares, short shares? And I feel like this is a good opportunity to just get some interesting data as a community here. What's your time frame? Are you in Nvidia for a short-term, like few day overnight swing? Or are you just keeping track of this thing and you're in here for the next 20 years? I'm very curious to find out. Let me know. All right, now here on the 4-hour chart, you can see that, yesterday we were talking about that white line, the 50 period, and, bulls, obviously we can't expect it's the 4-hour. It's going to take its time, right? We can't expect that thing to move upside extraordinarily quickly. But breaking 750, I mean, that would be a beautiful thing to see. Ideally, because we're just adding another psychological barrier above an existing psychological level, and I'd always prefer to see, as many psychological barriers that support my thesis or come close to supporting my thesis, or more so, if I had to explain this a little bit better, I would say not going directly against my enemy's thesis, so to speak. So, for example, I want as many things that if I'm bullish, I want to see as many things that bears would look at and say, oof, that's ugly, on as many time frames as possible that just support my side of the ball. And bears, your thesis here on the 4-hour, just really simple. Ideally, since there's not a whole heck of a lot that's in place specific to the 4-hour aside from the 50 period, you would really just want to see that thing flatten out, which would require probably another downside move in the stock just to make sure that doesn't get above 750. And I think I'd be happy here on the 4-hour, given that we don't really have a whole heck of a lot of else, to go off of on the 4-hour. But that brings us to the daily, which is the most important, and we have a lot to go off of here. The daily chart, the story here is incredibly obvious, and that's the way I like it, right? You don't overcomplicate it when it's clear. You're going directly against, this is my opinion now, however, I like to think that I'm correct about this. You're going directly against my belief that TA only works because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the whole point is that it works. I don't care why it works, right? I want to understand why it works, but as long as it works, I don't care. As long as it provides edge, I should say. Of course, it doesn't work all of the time. It works slightly more than half the time, I would say. However, when we're looking at a daily chart, I would argue it's almost not even TA at all. We're just reading the obvious psychology and then making decisions based around that. So look at this, right? There's almost no TA to be had. The nearest level is the 50-day moving average, and it's down around $600 a share. It's, of course, not even close to immediately relevant. What's the psychology here? Really simplify this in your head. It's $800 a share. I mean, it's so clear. It's so obvious. Every single human being on the planet that you show this chart to would say, well, I would think 800 would be pretty important. I would think that 823.94 high would be pretty important, and I think 750 would be pretty important. Even if I didn't have this line drawn, I think a lot of people could look at that and say, well, that seems to be an important level since it respected it on the upside and here at the bottom of that popping candle, right? So bears, here in the near term, right, your primary objective is of course to crack 750. And, that's more than just, well, I want the stock to go down. Because if it goes down to 775, you've made progress. But if your ultimate goal is $700 a share, 750 is something in your way. That's a barrier that you have to overcome. And ideally, you want to overcome those barriers as quickly as you can. 800 to the upside, obviously bears. Holding that as resistance is going to be incredibly important to your thesis. So on the flip side of that, bulls, 800 is the near-term goal. That's really all I'm paying attention to. 800 can give us a proper trampoline to try to make our way up toward a new all-time high, get up through 825. Now, implied volatility. This is going to be extremely important for those of you with options. Since yesterday, it has fallen from about 47.6%-ish, now down to about 44%, 44.2%. Now, if you happen to be running calculations about how much money you think you should have made or lost, calculating in the delta move into your calls or puts, the theta decay, and things aren't adding up, you're probably leaving out Vega, implied volatility. If you sold options, a downside move in IV will help you, right? But if you're buying options or if you have purchased and own options, a downside move in Vega can be, really something to overcome. That's why ideally you're always looking for the proper setup in the stock, first of all. But in addition to that, when you're looking to buy options, that goes for calls or puts, by the way, both of them, you ideally want IV to be as low as possible compared to your relevant trade time frame or your intended trade time frame. But IV right now, compared to the last 2 months, I would say, is in the low to mid range because we had this big spike heading into earnings. All right. Now, what was the bias among options traders here today? 933,000 total contracts traded. 557,000 of those were calls and 375,000 of those were puts. So we are seeing a call side bias on the overall ratio. The short-term speculators, a little bit more undecided, but still a slight call side bias. 194,000 calls versus 171,600 puts. But again, I mean, very interesting. This has been a common sight on Nvidia as of late. You look at every single delta range, right? That's out of the money, at the money, and in the money. Okay, on average, those contracts, as far as expirations are concerned, that's going to be more short-term sentiment, mid-term sentiment, and then more longer-term sentiment. Again, on average, all of them, all 5, leaning to the call side to varying degrees, yes, but all of them leaning to the call side, leading us to a relatively heavy, but not overwhelming by any means, call bias on the call put ratio. Listen, of course, this is just one factor of many. Always make sure your risk is managed and never take one factor as gospel. If you got value out of this video, I am covering Nvidia stock every single day. Appreciate you, and I'll see you tomorrow.